And we are live on YouTube.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. This
You're
week we have a special guest who needs no introduction. It's the founder, as I call her, who will be regaling us today with a great conversation about her new book, Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past. So because she needs no introduction, I'm just going to hand over the mic to her right away.
okay. Thank you so much. I have to turn on my video. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And just to tell you that from what I see here, we have already 100 people in this on Zoom. Then those of you perhaps who are not able to enter here, just go to YouTube and you'll be able to, from there, to put your questions and watch us live. And if Alex can send then a message for people who are in the waiting room, just telling them to perhaps go to YouTube, then I am very happy to be here with you today, folks. And this is then a conversation about this new book that I published in October 2020. Then I will just give an introduction that I will try to be brief. And then, of course, you are going to open to questions and to your comments as well. I'm not sure if any of you were able to read the book. The book was released in October, but it was pretty much delayed because of the fact that COVID then created it was difficult to have these then the copies, paper copies, then distributed on time. But I know that many of you got the book recently, at least. Then I have been working on this issue of memory of slavery and history of slavery for about 15 years, we can say, a little bit more than that. And I started looking at visual culture of slavery that emerged then in the 18th and 19th centuries. Then I did the work on how slavery is memorialized then in Brazil and in West Africa, especially in Republic of Benin. And then I started incorporating into my work the United States, as I have been living in the United States since 2008, and also France and England, because these were spaces where I circulated. I studied in France as well. My second language is French. And many of these debates regarding the memory of slavery emerged, I would say, earlier in France and England, then they emerged here in the United States. Now, one element that is interesting also is that there were very few works about memory of slavery in the United States produced by historians. Most of the existing works were then scholars who were working on this were scholars of in literature, also in anthropology, in sociology as well. For many historians, we could say that this field of inquiry that is then memory was considered as a field that is not a serious field. Now, what is interesting is that this situation, this context started changing in terms of how historians, they see the issue of memory of slavery. And this it started changing, then I would say, of course, for a series of reasons that I revisit in the book. Of course, that some scholars who started looking at how the slave past in countries like the United States. I think here, for example, about the story of the Hammonses in Monticello, then the descendants of the enslaved descendants of Thomas Jefferson. Then works like the work by Annette Gordon Reed were very important, were crucial to bring that story to light. Then elements of a context that started with the emergence of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, then in the early 1990s. And then in the United States, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 had a great impact in helping this memory of slavery to occupy the public space. I'm not saying that this memory was not there, that it didn't exist, but it was not as visible then in the public sphere and in the public space. But I would say that 2015, then at the moment when Black Lives Matter was already then in play and widespread in the United States and having also an impact abroad, we had this tragic event, this massacre in Charleston, when this domestic white terrorist killed then several members of the African American community in that Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. And that event ignited then much more protests regarding then the need of removing the Confederate flag that was then circulating then everywhere, then especially in the south of the United States. We had at that moment, just after that massacre, that Bree Newsom, who removed the Confederate flag that was at the South Carolina, then at the time that is still flying there, then in the State House of South Carolina. And after that event, there were also several other protests to either demanding to take down Confederate monuments, but also protests when then demonstrators, they took the matter into their own hands and took down those monuments. Then those debates have been happening since 2015 in ways that are much more visible, and not only debates, but you are having actions in the public space. And I have been following that. And then in addition to this, of course, we had then in 2017, the events in Charlottesville, and a series of other events when all these monuments, they became much more politicized than they used to be, and they became shrines for white supremacists, and also sites where Black activists and their allies then contested these issues. And the idea then to write this book emerged then in 2015. The idea was that the need that I saw in writing the book drew, of course, from my previous work. If you look at the book, for those, very few of you who know my previous work, but for those who know, you can identify some cases, I would say, especially when in the first chapter, when I am exploring then the issue of a collective memory of slavery, and that I look at the case of a Brazilian slave merchant in Republic of Benin. That is a case that I studied in my work in the past, and I reused that case under a new light in order to contrast, because that is a good example of how the collective memory of slavery operates. But then drawing from this work that I had already, I thought that it was, I wanted to intervene in this debate about the monuments and how we make slavery visible in the public space. Because I was seeing especially historians and all kinds of social actors who were intervening in this debate, and sometimes with very confusing ideas about what is history, what is memory, what is public memory, what is public history. And this confusion persists and has been useful either even politically, to some individuals, for example, who continue to affirm that removing, for example, monuments to pro-slavery individuals or Confederate monuments, that doing so is to erase history. Then a book like this, I thought that it would be useful to show that history is a discourse that has particular characteristics and that engage with the past, but monuments, memorials, museum exhibitions, commemoration activities, all these are not about history only. They are about memory, and memory is always a representation of the past, is operating in the present, even if it engages with the past. Then the idea of the book, the book is divided and in different chapters. In each chapter, the introduction pretty much outlines all these concepts of collective memory, cultural memory, public memory, official memory, public history. And then I added a final chapter that looks at art and memory, because by doing this work, I would find the work of artists incorporating all these modalities of memory and engaging perhaps in much more creative ways with this past, which is contentious, which is painful, and which is also traumatic. Then the introduction look at these concepts, and then first chapter explores the idea of collective memory of slavery. And here the important element that is raised is that collective memory is about transmission, then is never homogeneous, is always plural, and is as one sociologist, Morris Halbach's, put, is also framed by what we call social frameworks. And the social frameworks include, for example, family, religion, social class as well. Overall, I showed then that collective memory of slavery then is not the same for slave owners, slave merchants, enslaved people, and also is not the same for the descendants of these individuals. All of them, they construct a collective memory of these atrocities, but their memories differ. They are not homogeneous. Then I move to cultural memory in the second chapter. That is this form of memory that is ritualized and very often embodies, then takes form, takes some kind of materiality that becomes something that is tangible. And that we can see, for example, when you are referring to, especially to cemeteries of enslaved people, and also to the claims to construct then memorials honoring enslaved people. And the chapter pretty much looks then at this kind of initiative. I retrace also how these initiatives connect to other ways that other atrocities were memorialized. And here I am referring especially then to the Holocaust. And then, of course, there are other atrocities that came later that also use devices that are similar to the ones that we see when then social actors today, they are demanding to memorialize slavery. One of the elements that is, I would say, that are the most interesting elements in this conversation in the second chapter is are these monuments that are associated with the dead, then all the issue of naming and the demands then to construct memorials that include walls of names and names then the names that we know of enslaved people. Then I move then to the third chapter that is on public memory of slavery, which is a modality of memory that is politicized and that, again, not at all homogeneous, but depends on different groups that in the context of how slavery is memorialized are racialized, then groups that are racialized as Black and who identified either as descendants of enslaved people or who either identify as descendants of those who enslaved other people, that these groups, they go then to the public space and they go there to fight to occupy this public space. And this has been much of what we have been seeing regarding the Confederate monuments and other monuments that are that were how can I say then removed recently, then slavery monuments, monuments honoring then the colonizers and so on that we saw, of course, not only in the United States, but this summer we saw then in Britain, in France, and in Belgium, and even in Portugal, and so on. Then after this, I look also how these memories, they under some circumstances, they became official, then officialized. And here I look in particular at museums. Then it was a long battle to have slavery as a topic, as a problem that is included in the museum. And then that chapter that is on official memory looks at that. Then I explore then especially cases then in France, in England, and here in the United States as well, including the new museum, the new exhibition that is Slavery and Freedom in the new, not that new now, National Museum of African American History and Culture. In addition to that, then I concluded the book with this chapter. Then I have one particular chapter on public history, because I found that it was important. I am not a public historian. Very often, because I work with memory, I have people who think that what I do is public history, then which is not the case. But what I do in that chapter is to show how memory interacts with the work of public historians. Then public historians, they have then a particular profession, a particular view. They are there in historical sites or archives or museums in order to make this history that scholars produce accessible to the public, but they are not close to how memory operates. And here I explore in particular then in this last chapter, then these plantations that are Monticello and Mount Vernon. And then I end the book with a meditation about the works of a few artists. Then William Adjeté Wilson, that is a French artist, Rosana Paulino, who is a Brazilian artist, also then François Piquet, which is also a French artist who is active in Guadeloupe. Nona Faustin, also who is based here in the United States. And then I will stop here. Then the idea is of writing this book. First of all, I would like to tell you that this is a book that I made my possible, and the publisher and my editor also, how can I say, they encouraged me and to make the book, to write the book in ways that make it accessible to students, to teachers, to people who work in these different sites associated with the history and memory of slavery, and also a general public that has some kind of interest in these issues. In many ways, this book, the way it emerged and the way it developed several times, indeed, I considered like giving up the idea of doing this book, it becomes difficult sometimes to deal with topics that are too close to the present. And it was interesting because this very book club has a connection with the topic of the book, because about 5 years ago, indeed, I was not able to calculate. I was trying to calculate before I came here today, but I created a hashtag on Twitter that is Slaveryarchive. And this hashtag is intended to follow these debates, all kinds of things related to Atlantic slavery, either conferences, books, or new cemeteries that are uncovered, new statues, and so on. And it was much through this hashtag that I would follow many of the debates that are in the book. And then, of course, now with COVID-19, we have this book club that became the Slaveryarchive book club. But one element that is interesting that happened before the book was published, you are going to see then by reading the book, for example, the 3rd chapter on public memory talks about that monument to Edward Colston in Bristol and so on. That monument is no longer there. The book is already old before it was published, which is one of the problems of writing on the history of memory, because it's always changing, and these are not books that you can take 20 years to write. Because the debates, they are changing fast. But I think that at least through that chapter of the book, some people, they can have access to the origins and to the developments that led to the fall of some of these monuments in a very fast speed, especially during this summer. Then I will stop here. And if you have any questions, I will be glad to take them.
If you don't mind, so that we can do this in an organized way, I'd be happy to call them out as you ask the questions. We already have one from YouTube, but we always like to give you guys the first dip. If anybody has a question, please raise your hands. People know how to raise their hands, right? All right, we have Erica. Clinton, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to comment on your part about like the Confederate soldiers and like the different monuments you're speaking about. Would you recommend that we have those like monuments removed and taken down and put them in museums rather than have them just like in the public arena? And maybe like I was talking to my friend about this in England actually, where you have like some type of placard where it's explaining like the history behind these Confederate soldiers. So I know it is a part of our history, but they represent something kind of vile. And I recommend that. I don't know if you have the same idea of like making sure they go into museums so we still remember the history behind it, but understand like the evilness behind it as well.
How can I say, as a scholar, I do not make recommendations because it would be against the work that I do. Because as you can see from the book, each of these monuments, of course, they have a particular history. Then I personally, I think that most of these monuments, they should be removed, and they should be removed. In the book, I do not discuss one particular Confederate monument, but I discuss monuments such as the one that existed in Bristol, for example, to pro-slavery individuals. Then I have some discussion about the Robert E. Lee monument. Then the one in Charlottesville. The point is that in most places there was debate to remove the monuments. There were debates to contextualize the monuments, and none of these attempts was accomplished. And this is why this summer a number of then demonstrators, they took the matter into their own hands and took down the monuments. It was a very minority. It's very few monuments that were taken down by demonstrators. Most of them, indeed, they were removed by the different authorities that were in charge of these monuments. Then in some cases, then I can talk about the cases that I studied, and not about more than 1,000 Confederate monuments, but the case of the Colston Monument in Bristol, that monument will be in a museum. Then there was a decision, then apparently from what we know up to now, that monument was taken down. The demonstrators threw the monument in the river. Then one of the channels of the Avon River in Bristol, and that was recovered and is going to be in a museum with all the paint and everything that was there. Now, in some cases, then the community needs to decide if they want these monuments in a museum, if they don't want to see these monuments anymore, if they want these museums to go to a park, for example, where we would put all these dead monuments, and so on. Then these are decisions that I believe that is the community that must decide. But one point is clear: these monuments, they are not about history. They are about memory. And then they are not conveying any particular accurate view of the past, but they are conveying a certain view that particular groups in the past had about themselves, about their own history, and that today they are being resignified then by individuals who have sometimes nothing to do with this past, but who are appropriating these monuments as devices to continue affirming their supremacy as white individuals and as the heirs of those who fought to keep slavery alive in this country and in other countries as well.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
All right, next we have Craig Friend, and after we have Laura, and then we'll take a couple of questions coming in from YouTube.
Good afternoon. So I think you can probably anticipate that this book will position you to become a consultant for a lot of historic sites trying to deal with this issue. Do you have any thoughts on how historic plantation sites currently represent and memorialize enslaved peoples and how they might do better at that?
Yes, I did some work like as a sort of consultant in this place, Phillipsburg Manor in New York. Then they are doing an interesting job, but as I am a person with an accent who was born in Brazil, who is not necessarily then identified as the person who should be doing this kind of work, I'm not sure at all if I will become the ideal consultant. Also because then when people, they hire these consultants, they want to have answers that sometimes we cannot give. For example, what to do with a plantation like Monticello or Mount Vernon. There are things that we can do with these spaces in terms of telling first the history of the enslaved people, and perhaps telling this better. But at the end of the day, those are spaces of white supremacy that wherever you put there, it's not going to erase that history. Then it's something that is difficult. But in the book, then in the first chapter, and especially then in the chapter that is the chapter 5, there is chapter on public history, that I look at 2 plantations. There are these plantations of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, then Monticello and Mount Vernon. And Of course, at some point you are working on these issues, you have to recognize that people, they are making efforts. These efforts, of course, didn't come naturally. We had activists, we had scholars that for several years, 1 century even, in the case of more than 1 century, in the case of Mount Vernon, have been fighting to make this history recognized in those sites. Then there are forces in play in those places that are engaging and are open to these efforts. But there are limits as well, and the limits are associated with the fact that these are places that are there to commemorate these men who are slaveholders, and you never become a place to commemorate those who are enslaved there, even if they were the majority. Then I think that Monticello is doing a good and interesting work on these issues. But in these 2 places, I would say, if I can only refer to 2, and we can develop the 2 elements that are very problematic in these 2 places, are the so-called mentions. Then there are efforts to interpret the slave quarters. We have apps, we have websites, we have plaques. But essentially, if you decide to go to Monticello or Mount Vernon and visit only the mansions and the gardens, perhaps you can go there and learn absolutely nothing about the fact that these were slavery sites. Inside these mansions, sometimes we have, for example, guides and the bands, guides who will talk about the slavery depending on who is visiting. If they are asked, we have much more docents now who are trained to talk about that. But there are no visual reminders in these mentions that evoke, that refer to enslaved people. And this is one of the elements. Then when you visit, especially the mentions are the solid elements in these places that were not yet affected by that. Monticello, when they discovered the place where Sally Hemings used to live 2 years ago, they announced that they would, how can I say it? I don't remember the word that they used regarding that, the visit to the mansion, that would no longer be the way it is. But as far as I know, it didn't change. Now, of course, it's closed. Mount Vernon, the tour of the mansion is exactly the same as it used to be in the last years. You go there, you visit that more or less quickly, and they talk about enslaved people only when the guide, the docent is at the kitchen. Then these are, I would say, elements to be changed. And I am talking about the rich plantations. Now, if you go to other plantations, there have much less means and are not very visible, then all these issues are much more problematic. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
Anna, thank you for the work. I pride myself on being intrepid and being able to find things, but I have not yet gotten the book. My question though comes from knowing that you work so hard to do this comparatively, and it comes from a place. I once participated in a workshop at the Caribbean Studies Association, and we were talking about undergraduate education and their ability to engage, or willingness to engage with historical subjects. And the meeting was in Salvador, it was in Brazil. We've taken that for the Caribbean. And some of the Latin American and Caribbean-based scholars, they raised their hands and they said, you people in the global North, you seem to think that our students in the global South or in a newly independent Caribbean country are more willing than your mostly white students in UK or US or wherever to engage these topics. And I wondered if you could say what you found in doing this work about, I guess, the differences or similarities between, say, what this means to try to deal with slavery and public memory if you're in the colonizing metropolis or the UK, or in the sort of white supremacist United States, versus in some place where there is a Black majority population or the population is different. Because we were very much criticized, and rightly so, for assuming that somehow let's say a Black population in Jamaica is more willing to be talking about slavery all the time.
Yes, thank you, Roseanne, for that. Then just to clarify, then I didn't do work then on the in the Caribbean. Now I did in Brazil, and I think that is fine because Brazil was the largest slave society then, along with US and Cuba. Now it's true, but I would say that is not, it depends on the region. In a country like Brazil, for example, that perhaps people will be less engaged less willing to engage with this past. But the reasons why this past is hidden, is not visible in the public space in places like Brazil, the reasons are essentially similar to those that prevented this past to be visible in a place like the United States or in countries like England and France. Then let's take the example, then of course, Brazil, more than 50% of the population is of African descent, but it depends also on where you go. In places like Bahia, where I did work there, 80% of the population is identified as Black. But it's still those who have the political power are not Black people. This Salvador in Bahia never had a mayor who is a Black person. Then these are the people those who are deciding what should be visible or not, are essentially then these elites, which of course are white. Now, regarding the ways that this past appears is with a connection with Africa. The connection with Africa is much emphasized through commemoration, the carnival, the so-called African roots that appear in dances, candomblé religion, and so on. But it's still with no references to how these Africans they got there. No markers regarding places where slave markets existed, where different sites associated with slavery, for example, places where enslaved people were disembarked. And for a very long time, this story, even by scholars, was not valued. When I published a book in 2010 saying that about Bahia, one reviewer who is a prominent historian here in the United States, who covers the South Atlantic, he claimed that yes, there are no monuments to slavery in his review, but Black culture is everywhere in Bahia, and this would in many ways suffice. But apparently is not really the case. Now we have in Bahia a group, including historians, who are creating a project exactly to map and to bring to light the places that are associated with the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, including many markers that are that honor then slaveholders and slave merchants. Then I would say that in the South, this narrative has also been controlled by, in some cases, then a minority of people who are identified as whites, who are in the universities there, who have been holding their places in the academia, in the academy in very strong ways, even if, of course, in Brazil over the last 20 years, we had then important changes regarding all these issues. But I would say that if we had ways to compare, in many ways, sometimes the ways that slavery is memorialized in a country like the United States and in a country like Brazil, perhaps they are different. But the African American population has, of course, much more political power than the political power of the Afro-Brazilian population. Then since the period of the civil rights movement, then there are growing demands to make this past recognized, Whereas in Brazil in the 1960s, we were under a military dictatorship. Then the Afro-Brazilian population was not even in a position of making these demands. Then it's something that is difficult. But I would say that what is interesting and beautiful about the moment that you are living is that we have much dialogue with among these different countries. And this project that we see emerging in Bahia now, that is called Salvador Escravista, in every place where I go, I refer to this project. They have a website and so on. This is a project that emerged in the light of the events that took place during the summer with the fall of Colston and other monuments.
Thank you. So I'm going to take now a couple of questions that are coming in from YouTube. Vanessa has been taking those over there and sharing them here with me in our chat. And I'm going to start with this one that follows right on Laura's question. So this comes from Philip Luc Sinitier. And it's a little bit out of order for when they came in on YouTube, but I think it's a good segue right after this question. And that is, did research and writing this book shift how you teach about slavery and memory in the classroom? And I should add that Ana Lucia teaches in a historical Black college, which is still predominantly Black. So it kind of is also a nice variation on the question. So did this book actually change the way you teach memory in your own classroom, Ana?
Let me answer. I would say that when you are always changing, then the book could not exist without my classroom and without the place where I teach, which is a historically Black university. Then these discussions we are having all the time in the classroom. I do not teach to my undergraduate students a specific course on memory of slavery. I teach a course on memory of slavery to graduate students. But recently, about 1 year ago, I created one course that can be taught to undergraduate students. Then this is something that probably I will be able to develop. I will say that in a course, Introduction to African Diaspora, you have sometimes 1 or 2 sections that you are going to dedicate to that. Then the book certainly will encourage me to expand this approach. And I think also that as we are in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area where I am based, it will become interesting to do much more work around the sites that are here that perhaps in the past could be something more abstract to the students. But after this summer, with all the monuments that were taken down and all this issue becoming so discussed, I believe that this will be a topic that will be more interesting to be taught in the classroom. And certainly the book, and I would say that it's a two-way avenue. Then students through my classes, they helped me to shape the problems of the book. And the problems of the book, they are still in development. And when I continue teaching, I will continue then developing this the problems that I raised in the book.
All right, and a reminder for those of you who are joining us on Zoom that if you want to ask a question here, you can raise your hand and I will put you in the queue. So this is the first question that came on YouTube earlier, and this one is by Vinicius Pereira. And it says, Ana, congratulations on your book. You argue that racism and white supremacy impact the way we deal with memory about slavery. You argue that the fact that the Nantes History Museum and the Aquitaine Museum do not clearly address European responsibility in the Atlantic slave trade may be an expression of this impact. I wonder if you can make some comments about how you understand the impact of white supremacy and racism on the way Brazilian museums represent slavery. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just clarify one thing. My connection at the moment, at part, I know that the question was long, but there was part of the question that for me was that you were frozen. Then can you repeat like fast?
Yes, so.
I got to the beginning and the end.
Okay, so he was providing a little bit more context. He says, you argue that the fact that the Nantes History Museum and the Aquitaine Museum do not clearly address European responsibility in the Atlantic slave trade. And that may be a result, right, of the white supremacy and the racism. But he wants to, so Vinicius wants to know how this phenomenon actually plays out in the Brazilian museums.
Okay, Brazilian museums. First of all, I do not talk about Brazilian museums in the book. Then if you are waiting the book to see something about Brazilian museums, you are not going to find anything there. But I would say that I have a very short book that I am preparing, finishing, and perhaps it's going to be out next year. And that book is just about museums. It's a very tiny book. And in that book, I talk about Brazil. Now, Brazil does not have a slavery museum. Indeed, there is one place that is called the Slavery Museum in Minas Gerais that was then created then about 4 decades ago. And we have, of course, the Afro-Brazil Museum in São Paulo. That is not a slavery museum. That is a museum then that celebrates African Brazilian culture. We have community museums such as the Blacks Museum in Rio de Janeiro that is currently closed, that is associated with a Catholic Brotherhood in Rio de Janeiro. And most of these museums, how do they represent slavery? Is overwhelmingly by emphasizing victimization, then through instruments of torture, representing then enslaved people naked, being whipped, attached to whipping posts. And this we have in the Júlio de Castilhos Museum in Porto Alegre in the south. We have in the Cities Museum in Bahia, in Salvador, in Bahia as well. Then in terms of the approaches that these museums, they are using in Brazil, they are still associated with an idea that was present in the Brazilian historiography until the 1980s. That was that idea that enslaved people, they had no agency. They were absolute victims that were not able to revolt, to react against slavery. And this is the way that Brazilian white supremacy that is in that context called racial democracy. This is the way that is present in the museums. Then first of all, with this idea of victimization, physical punishment, and also another element, very often this emphasis on racial mixture. Then the showing that Brazil is formed by those 3 groups. There are the European, the Portuguese, then the indigenous and the Black, and that these 3 groups, they interacted harmoniously and they gave birth to a society that essentially is not, where racism is not an issue. Then these museums, they do not address that. The only one that does is the Museum Afro-Brazil, but it's still there. There are issues to be criticized. And very often also, for example, in places like Bahia, there is I don't know how to say the name in English, but in Bahia, there is a Museu Náutico da Bahia that is in Salvador. And there is also the maritime history. Then the Atlantic slave trade is just an appendix of the maritime history. And this story is not at all emphasized. Now, in Brazil, there has been debates about the creation of a slavery museum. There is a a bill now that is being proposed to create a slavery museum. There was one that was created, at least on paper, to be there in Rio de Janeiro, near the place where enslaved people disembarked. These proposals were not yet, were not accomplished yet. Then all this is on paper.
Thank you. Now, there was a question that kind of ties to the one that Philip Luxinitier asked, but I'm going to rephrase it a little bit so that actually it can take us maybe in an interesting new direction. And I already see that we have also the question comes after this one. We'll get to that one. This one is, did your own historical knowledge of slavery itself change? Or how did it change? How does your own historical encounter, as you study in memory, did you learn anything new about slavery as you were researching the memory of it?
Okay. I was going to mute myself, but I am already unmuted. I think we are always learning. Then is very hard to say exactly what I learned and when, because the work that I do, I go back and forth doing works that are much more focused on this issue of memory, and then I come back. For example, the next two projects that I am working on are not on memory of slavery. They are really on what we can call history, because I'm looking at the past, not making connections with the present. Then I would say that I learned the knowledge that I have doing history of slavery allows me to understand how slavery is memorialized in the present. One of the problems that other scholars in other fields, and then I'm going to make here the case for historians who are studying memory of slavery, what can be sometimes be tricky is that if you are not familiar with the history and you are just analyzing these discourses without having and understanding, for example, what I was talking about the historiography in Brazil that portrayed enslaved people in a certain way. And this is somewhat the way that we find then enslaved people represented in the museum. This, I would say that if you do not know that historiography, perhaps you are not going to catch that. Perhaps if you do not know the history of Brazilian dictatorship and all those representations of people being tortured and so on, and how that matches with those representations of enslaved people being whipped, or even the Catholic mentality in Brazil, that idea of the body of Christ suffering, bleeding, and so on, then history informs the way that I look at memory, but memory also informs in the other direction, my study of history. But I would say that is just difficult to situate exactly what I learned and when. I would say that among the elements that I learned is the issue of how there are much more connections between the ways these nation states, they see their participation in these atrocities. There are much more similarities than we can imagine. And I would say that this is one of the elements. Also, the ways that racism operates in these different societies then led these communities to protest, especially the issue of police violence that has been at the heart of all these protests that led to the demands to remove monuments. This has been also another element that is very that is connected in all these places. Then I would say that I am learning like almost I am discovering these things almost in a daily basis, and it is hard. I don't have that distance at this point to say I found this and this and that, but I found a lot then in both directions, I would say.
think for a little variety, we're going to have Vanessa join us here and herself voice the questions from YouTube. Vanessa, are you there?
Everybody. So there are a couple of questions here. We're going to go a little bit out of order because I think these two questions pair really nicely and blend really well with what Anna's already talking about. So it's really the two sides of the same question here. So Miles Lee asks, says there have been many U.S. presidents and other prominent individuals in U.S. history who committed egregious racist acts and promoted slavery, such as Andrew Jackson, yet their monuments remain in place. In terms of taking down monuments and memorials of famous people in American history, where do we draw the line? And then a little further down, LB Johnson asks, can you address the accusation that taking down monuments referencing slavers and slaveholders is erasing history?
Then where do we draw the line? I do not know. I do not know where we draw the line. I do not do any policy. Nobody's asking me to advise anybody regarding policy and where things should stop. Then as a scholar, what I am doing is following what the social actors are doing and trying to understand why they are doing. For example, I could not imagine that exactly this summer we would have a pandemic and that this would encourage people to go to the streets again because of the murder of George Floyd, that this would ignite movements in Belgium, in Portugal, in Brazil, even in places like Mexico. There were monuments that were contested. Then I do not know where we draw the line, but the line should be drawn by citizens who are voting and keeping individuals in power who are promoting the racism, who are promoting white supremacy, and who are also promoting hate and how can I say, emboldening these groups to go to places like Charlottesville to protect monuments to Robert E. Lee, even if they don't even know sometimes who was Robert E. Lee and so on, but they see there something that represents and is an occasion for them to continue then fighting for this how can I say, protecting these ideas that are not only racist, but they are ready to use weapons to kill people like they did in Charlottesville. Then this is where we draw the line. The line should be drawn that this kind of appropriation of these monuments as shrines to white supremacy, that this should not be possible, especially when majority of citizens in the cities, they have been asking to take down these monuments. This is where the line should have been drawn. If you take the example of Colston, for how many years citizens in Bristol have been asking to remove, to contextualize, to put a plaque or do whatever with that monument, and nothing was done. Now, the monuments do not erase any history. For anybody here who wants to know this history is very well documented. It is in the archives, it is in the newspapers. We have the internet today. We can have photographs of all these monuments, when they were built, by whom, who financed them. Then this is where history is. Now, monuments, they are put there by people who have political interests in a particular moment and who have a particular view of the past. Time changes, then the history is about change. And if history is about change, these monuments should change as well. Nothing says that a monument should stay in a certain place and never goes away. And this is my point with the issue of erasing history. No history was erased. The monuments are not about history.
Can be clearer than that. I love the last sentence. No history was erased. Vanessa, you want to take Jean's out, or you want me to read it?
He's actually with us now on the Zoom,
Oh.
so he can come on and ask.
Hey, Jean. Salut. Please, go
I
ahead.
came back on Zoom. There was no room when I arrived, but some room open now. So I'm back on Zoom. So thank you very much for this beautiful book. I have a question, because in your response, like in the construction of the book, I feel like a contradiction. On one way, you finish the book by a chapter on art, letting the reader think that it could be the best way to do. And, it's like a beautiful end of the book. And on the other way, you just said that you don't consider Afro-Brazil Museum as in this field. And you did not speak of the museum from Guadeloupe. And these two museums are precisely connecting art and memory. So my question is, I would be happy to know a little more on your position on what art can do in this question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm muted. Thank you, Jean. Nice to see you. Then how can I say? I would say that what art does in this particular debate is that it provides views that are more complex, that are not binary in terms of victims and perpetrators. I think that artists, through their own experience as men and women who are racialized as Black and whites and so on, they can provide also views that are much more personal and based in their own experiences about the way that either their families or the way they are racialized leads them to engage with this slavery past. Then the reason why I do not include museums that are art museums, then the Museum of Guadeloupe I didn't visit. Then there are many other places that I could have used as examples, and this is a museum that is pretty recent that I didn't visit, and then I didn't use it. Now, regarding the Afro-Brazil Museum, like I am looking at this in this short book that I am finishing now, but that is an institution then that the chapter on art and memory focused much more on the work that artists individually, how they are engaging with this past, and then of course how some of these museums have incorporated their works to tell this story. Then it's interesting because the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool is doing this work for several years, bringing artists. The museum, the Afro-Brazil Museum, it's the director, Lucia Araujo, he doesn't call, that is not a slavery museum. And he is an artist himself. Then to use the Afro-Brazil Museum, I would have to use the museum as an entity. And this is not what I did in the book. The chapter on artists focuses on individual artists. But I will be talking about that museum then in the next very short book that I am doing. But I still remain with the idea that perhaps artists, not necessarily artists in the traditional sense of the term that I use in the book, but if you see the work that is being done collectively by people who are intervening in this monument of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, the monument as it is now, it is the result of this sort of collective work of art. And I think that there is something interesting there. Also, we see what this Mellon project, that I do not necessarily agree that this is the good way to go, but the Mellon Foundation is giving this a lot of money now for artists and so on, and groups who want to rethink these Confederate monuments. And I think that is through there that we go. Not that is any sacred path, but I think that there is something there that is an alternative to think about something that is a complex past. I don't know if I answered your question or if the contradiction remains there.
It's a little, but it's an interesting contradiction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. If I may take the co-host prerogative and ask a question, a follow-up question of the founder, very related to Jean's. First of all, I loved the book. This gave me a framework I just didn't have, in order to, be able to sort out the different ways in which we can approach memory from a materialist perspective. This is not a mystic. What you do in this book is actually, you don't make this mystical category. You don't make memory into a mystical category. You make memory into something we can that can be accessible through empirical historical research. And this is wonderful for me. This is a cultural, public, collective. I would even say that official, and then of course public history. And I would say at the end we go back to memory in a strange new category, artistic memory. But this is the one that I want to then perhaps ask you if there are ways to expand this one to actually have like subcategories maybe, or even just, because for example, like literature. So what is the memory of slavery in literature? This is still not history. This is still not about, what about song? And what about film? What about, we have so many exciting new film directors doing wonderful new work right now, right? It feels like there's always something there to tease out. What about language itself, for example, in the ways that the memory of slavery remains in sort of idiomatic expressions, vocabulary, etc. So I was wondering if you could expand that toolkit that you kind of opened the little window there at the end with art, that in a way that actually makes these things also sit side by side. The other chapters, the other forms of memory.
Yeah, it's interesting. If certainly that one of the interesting things that happen when you do this kind of work is, of course, it is impossible to look at all the examples. For example, let's suppose the museums. Then there are museums in Argentina, in Colombia, in Venezuela, then the entire Caribbean. There are other countries in Europe that I didn't look. Then this is something that for those who want to do work on this, there is work to do there. There is work to do there regarding the monuments as well, in terms of geographical areas. Now, in addition to that, that final chapter, because of course art, I was trained as an artist, then as an art historian as well. This is a zone that I can navigate, I would say somewhat naturally, and this is why I was seeing that it is visual, because museums are visual, then the monuments, they are visual as well. Now, if we expand those categories in a different study, there are many avenues to be explored in connection with the other modalities of memory. Then you mentioned already literature. We can think about language, all, for example, the words, the names, and so on that are associated to this slavery and slave trading past. Then this we could for example, associate with cultural memory and collective memory. All the issue, for example, of dance, music, cooking, and so on. Then there is work to be done there. I am not just sure if historians would be the good people to do that kind of work. Perhaps they could. But this is a work that also requires this other disciplines and other tools that sometimes we do not have. Then it was a practical and natural, let's say, choice for me to go with art. Now, if I had to do that with film or with literature, then I would go into a zone that is not mine. But I encourage everyone who would like to take from there to do so, because there is a lot of work to be done. And this using examples, then of course, not only from the Americas, but from Africa and Europe as well.
Thank you. I think we have next Chelsea Stewart, who is going to be our guest in March 24th of next year. Putting that little bookmark there. Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Ana Lucia, thanks so much. It's so exciting to see your book out. And so my question's related actually to the other, the seminar that you maybe mentioned or related obviously to your work at Howard, which is the Slavery, Memory, and African Diasporas seminar that you run. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the discussions there about other people's work, but also your work in formation helped shape the book.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chelsea, and it's nice to see you. It helped to shape the book because then first I discussed then that at least I discussed one chapter of the book in the seminar, and one of the elements that in the seminar encouraged, I would say, to do this kind of work is the fact that we have this dialogue among various disciplines. And this is something that opens up to have also people who are working in different spaces. Then we are not only working on the United States or Brazil and so on. Then this is a way that intellectually, I think that helped me to shape the book. Then I would say that. Certainly then it's like the question regarding the classroom. This is something that is always going on. It's like this seminar, this book club that now is we are having online. This book club in many ways emerged from a hashtag that informed the work that I did here. And then now we are connecting with a variety of people that some of us, we already knew each other, and of course that we are fed by the works of scholars with whom we are in dialogue. Then even if you look at the list of the slavery seminar or this book club, there are these affiliations that are intellectual and also affective. And I think that this is very important. In my work is very important. Then I navigate through different languages, different spaces, and this affective dimension is important even for me to open a book and to want to read a book. The fact that I know the people who wrote then your book that you are going to discuss in the spring, then I know you, I read the chapter we discussed then in the seminar, and I think that this is something that allows us to want to know more. And this is why it's so important, I would say, even for students, graduate students and undergraduate students, to join these intellectual communities, because it's when perhaps you know people, you hear them, you hear you listen their, how can I say, their insecurities, their questions, their problems, their doubts about their own work. This is something that encourages us to go ahead. Thank you.
That was a great answer. I want to echo that. I want to second that motion. Next, we have comment from Michael. Michael, you there? Yeah, there you
Yes, I'm right here. Okay, I just want to comment on the uniqueness of this work on memory for something that is still so active because when I first saw that this book was coming out, the first thing that came to mind is what I'm looking at right now, The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell, except he wrote this like 50 years after the Great War ended. And the idea that, not that we don't need to do it, but the idea that we need to and we will be discussing memory of an event that is close to directly affecting so many world citizens. 1888, 130 or 40 years after the last country outlawed it, is pretty amazing. And I think I agree. It's very important that this be discussed worldwide, because in theory, this should have been done decades ago, because theoretically and according to law, slavery ended. But then there continues to be, regarding documentaries such as The 13th on Netflix, whether the effects of slavery are still active. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, Professor, or not, but I just thought it was worth saying, because the idea of memory on something that's still going on, the memory for many people around the world, it's not a memory. The effects are still with us. So that's why I don't have the book yet, and I will be getting it very soon, and I will probably breeze through it like I did the last one. So any comments you have would be great, but I just think this book is very important. I couldn't agree with what you said more. And I know very often we don't want to promote ourselves too much, but I think this is just so important that I need to say that. Okay, so.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And it's fine to promote yourself. We have to promote ourselves, because unless you have someone to do that for you, that you have someone that you can pay to do for you, it's important to promote yourself. Now, I just want to comment the fact that I would say that one of the points that the book makes regarding, because we are always talking about erasing history, and I think that one of the points that the book makes is that all these debates about slavery, the slave trading past, and all these that are focused on monuments and so on, that all these issues are related indeed to the persistence of racism, racial inequalities, then systematically white supremacy. These are the elements that are, how can I say, the expressions of the afterlives of Atlantic slavery, because racism and even the idea of race as we still have today emerges then, and the idea of anti-Black racism emerges with the Atlantic slave trade. And I think that these are the legacies that remain alive. And I do not want to enter the zone of the 13th amendment debate, but I think that the legacies are not, because this is a debate that, in addition to how problematic it is a debate that is associated particularly with the United States. But again, we have the same kind of anti-Black racism that persists in places like Brazil, in France, in Portugal, and so on, that we should be looking at these other spaces as well. And this is where the dialogue between racism and memory of slavery is, I would say, useful. Thank you.
Vanessa?
So we have another set of questions from YouTube. Sue Kozel asks 3. I'm gonna put 2 of them together because I think they're sort of in the same vein. And then there's maybe a spicier one, asking for your quick take on what can be done at certain historic sites. So Sue asks, first, Sue thanks you for your visionary leadership, and then goes on to ask if you address the murder of enslaved people and the sort of punishments or lack of punishment for their murderers, sort of you're assuming that their murderers are white. And then another question that's also kind of about, what factors into this memory of slavery, what pieces get remembered or commemorated. What is the most appropriate way to address memorials for Potter's Fields to honor African Americans, mostly enslaved people, buried without record or their names? So I think both of these questions really point towards what is included in this memory of slavery and what is excluded. And then for the spicier third question, Anna, you gave strong critique of Monticello's and Mount Vernon's discussion of enslavement. I agree. What is one major change you would like to make in Monticello and Mount Vernon's programming or public history? You're muted, Anna. I don't want to miss the answer.
Okay.
I don't want to miss the answer.
No, I was trying to look at on YouTube to see because the first two questions I'm not sure if I got them. I would say that the issue of Monticello and Mount Vernon, I think that I answered that when Craig gave me his answer in the very beginning. I think that the mansions are places that should be, let's say, dismantled. Then dismantled, I'm not asking to take down the mansions, but those tours of those mansions should be totally revised. Then this is not something that is difficult to do. And this is really the last elements that we see in these two places and everywhere, that the dimension is the central element of these visits. And this what is not at all, then these visits regarding these sites remain segregated visits. And this is a term that Stephen Small, in a book that was published almost 20 years ago, would say when he visited, they did research in several of these plantations, then these tours continue to be segregated despite the inclusion of slavery. And the central element where slavery is not addressed and is the central place where slavery is not addressed is the mansions, then those should be totally revised, if not eliminated. And we have one place where this happens, that is the Whitney Plantation, that I examine not the entire thing, but the memorials that they have, the walls of names I examine in the book. And that plantation is one that the mansion is not at all central. The mansion is there because it was there, but it's not central. Then I think that this would be a way to address the problem of these two sites. And it would be a very difficult thing to do, because these sites, we should be aware that most of those who visit these sites are white individuals, white families of middle class. They go there to know about the founders and not about the slavery. Then perhaps there is a space to talk about the slavery in the slave quarters somewhere along the site, but bring this to the mansion would make that central, and it was central. Are these sites willing to do that? I do not think so, not yet. We are going to see. I'm not sure if I understood the other questions, especially the first one.
Yeah, I think that they're along the lines of what is included in either commemoration or memorials. So how could we appropriately mark like Potter's Fields where there are unmarked graves for enslaved people, or are there ways to commemorate or think about or remember murders of enslaved people?
Yes, I would say that there are many ways to do so. I do not cover this in particular in the book, but for example, in this country, and I said that a few days ago in another presentation, and then someone told me that I will repeat the story here. For example, in the United States, Denmark Vesey, then we have Blaine Roberts, and oh my God, I forgot his name, Keitel, who did this book on the Denmark Vesey Garden. And the monument to Denmark Vesey in Charleston was built just a few years ago, and it was a monument that took many years to be constructed because of the opposition by white citizens in Charleston to honor what they considered a murderer. And this man, indeed, he was killed then in the aftermath of the plot that he led. Now, we do not have monuments then in the United States to individuals. Then you, Vanessa, you are the good example, Nat Turner. And then I had someone who told me in another panel that there were plenty of monuments to Nat Turner in the United States. I think that the person Googled monuments to enslaved people, and there were all those images of monuments in the Caribbean. And the person was understanding that that was in the United States. Now, there are monuments to people who are murdered. For example, Zumbi of Palmares in Brazil, there are monuments to him in many different places, and Zumbi, his anniversary is now on Friday. Then monuments could be created, and in many places, as I show in the book, especially in the second chapter, I would say that especially this has been not because I think that this is a model to follow, but many Black citizens and in different Black communities, for example, here at William and Mary, University of Virginia, we have also this in Paris, in Saint-Denis, then in the Whitney Plantation in the South, then these walls of names honoring enslaved people are identified as one of the ways of memorializing enslaved people. Then we even have those places where we have those small plaques in particular sites where enslaved people lived, and this is in dialogue with ways of memorializing the Holocaust. And this is something that could be that could be considered as an alternative to the sort of a statue honoring then that is the traditional statue that we see in many places. I hope that I answered.
Thank you. Do we have anybody that wants to ask a question? Because I will never let a good silence go by unused. You let me know. Well, if I may ask another question.
You can ask, but you can also then if there are no other questions, you can go ahead and conclude as well. But I will be happy to answer your question. Go ahead.
So now everybody will blame me. All right, just really quickly because I have to, because I mean, my world is a world of digital scholarship and public history. Right now, I'm working on a project to reimagine Rose Hall Plantation in Jamaica, by the way, which is an interesting one because that one is owned by a Republican lady in Delaware, and it's turned into this kind of like Disney-fied story of the White Witch of Rose Hall. Is this kind of very driven by this kind of motive of Disneyfication that we're familiar with from Jamestown, etc. So we're trying to actually recenter the lives of the enslaved in the plantation and their lives there and their kin relationships. But we have to do so in a virtual layer because we cannot we cannot buy the plantation from these people. We don't have the money. So the only thing we can do is a kind of culture jamming. But I am seeing this kind of culture jamming existing in the virtual realm kind of grow. I see in the past couple of decades, it's slightly different than tearing down monuments, right? Because this is projection. And it's not only used only by people trying to center the lives of slaves, it's also done also by people who want to whitewash stuff. For example, here at Columbia University, instead of taking down the names of the Plato or Aristotle in front of the Butler Library, we just put the name of women on a little banner that we will probably take away in a couple of years. So this kind of layer that does not really affect the core, but it's there. I wonder if you thought about, you mentioned it in passing a couple of times in the book, but I wonder if you had any more thoughts, or if this was an avenue you wanted to explore more of this kind of virtuality that allows us to counteract.
Yes, I would say that it has been done. It has been done, and it is being done. And in many ways, I would say that it's a creative way, an alternative way of dealing with these monuments. And I believe that this is the important element as well. There is no receipt to across the board everywhere to do exactly the same thing. Some interventions, apparently, they are more appropriate. For example, the Colston monument that was removed in Bristol, there were several interventions in that monument, which were very interesting. Then interventions that put the bodies, the small figurines of bodies of enslaved Africans, then reproducing that, the Brooks, the slave ship, and all those interventions would be removed. But they were interesting because the monument was still there, and the citizens were engaging with that monument. And this is one of the elements that I understand that people who think that just removing the monuments is not a solution, because of course that the monument was put there. There were citizens who protected that monument, who sponsored the monument. And it is an important marker to show that this place valued this kind of pro-slavery individual until year 2020. Then by putting these layers that you are saying, you continue to have that reminder that this place has a past that is associated with racism and white supremacy and the Atlantic slave trade. And you are in conversation with that. Then the projections, for example, then this we see a lot in the monument in Richmond, that many people, they are saying, oh, you should not remove because the monument as it stands now, totally painted, is a different kind of monument that is not the monument that was created by these pro-Confederate individuals. And then there are other ways of doing this virtually, for example, using the internet. Then nothing would prevent from having, for example, a view of these plantations and having layers added to it. Then I would say just that we are not anymore in many of these places at the stage of doing that. Then things arrived at a point that these conflicts, they are so hard, and these debates have been going for so long that it's no longer the time, it's no longer the moment to demand to have an alternative monument to Colston and keep him there. It was the time of taking down, and this is done. It cannot be undone at this point. But perhaps in other places, this is something to be considered, and perhaps in most of the places, this is what, for example, the case of Bordeaux in France, which is not about monument, but is about the names of the streets that are named after slave merchants and people involved in the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. The group that was consulted and included and members of the community, academics, and so on, they decided to not rename the streets, but decided to create big plaques for those streets and add to those plaques then a long paragraph explaining the involvement of these men with the Atlantic slave trade. Then this was done there, and I would say that in some other places perhaps it's possible, but not in places where the conflict is already so exposed that we cannot come back in time.
Thank you very much.
You have a beautiful dog there.
If nobody has any questions, then I think we should all join together in a virtual applause of the founder and her great book. And for those of you who have not read it, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do read it. It is enormously useful for all of us doing both history, cultural heritage. It touches on so many of our activities. Next Saturday, we're going to, mine is in my bookshelf. Do you have your copy, Anna, there?
I have, but I am trying, let me just see where it is. Oh, it's here.
Yes, because mine, I would have to get up, and I have a whole setup with lights and stuff like that. It's not going to be
okay.
Anna only has her book.
Okay. Then this is the book by Manuel Barcia, and we are going to be discussing the book on Saturday at 1 p.m. Barcia is a historian then who is based in Britain. Then he's in Leeds, indeed. Then he's in Britain. Then this is why you are doing the Slaveryarchive book club at 1 p.m. on Saturday. And the title of the book is The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade, was published by Yale University Press this year. And I hope that you'll be joining us and that we'll be inviting more people to join us to continue this conversation. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you, everybody who came today.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. The famous bye-bye at the end.